Women in Climate is a podcast sponsored by GIB Asset Management and brought to you by The National. GIB Asset Management is a boutique asset manager with sustainable investments at the core of their active investment business. Their belief is working together as one, bound by a common purpose to be a force for performance, a force for better. Find out more at gibam.com. Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of the Women in Climate podcast series, sponsored by GIB Asset Management and brought to you by The National. I'm your host, Naomi Kerbel, and in this episode, we're spotlighting 3 more trailblazing women who are shaping the future of our planet. In our last episode, we spoke about the latest innovations that are being developed to help us mitigate the impacts of climate change, and today we're going to explore the question of how to fund them. As we work toward a net zero future, the world faces an urgent need to direct vast financial resources into industries and solutions that not only help combat climate change, but also foster long-term, positive social and environmental impact. Trillions of dollars are needed for the energy transition, from renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure to green technologies and climate adaptation projects. But it's not just about the size of the financial commitment. It's about making sure that every dollar is invested and contributes to systemic change, fostering a cleaner, more resilient world. At COP29, a landmark agreement was reached with developed nations committing to providing $300 billion annually to help developing countries decarbonise, alongside additional private investment to accelerate the global transition. But we have seen now that major players are pulling back from their net zero ambitions. So is there a shift, and how do we stay on track? And where funds are committed, how do we ensure that these funds are used effectively and equitably? And what principles should guide these investments to make the greatest impact? Joining me today is Victoria Barron, Chief Sustainability Officer at GIB Asset Management, a boutique asset manager with sustainable investments at the core of their active investment business. Habiba Al-Marashi, President and CEO of Arabia CSR Network, ACSRN, and the co-founder and chairperson of Emirates Environmental Group, among many other incredible ventures. And Avery Johnston, manager at KPMG's Global Decarbonisation Hub, specialising in just transition research, youth engagement, global policy, and the intersection of gender and climate. Welcome to you all. So, Victoria, if I can come to you first, your career has been predominantly in sustainable investing, and you're currently CSO of GIB Asset Management. And before that, you were head of sustainable investment at Brightwell, which was working with BT's pension scheme. Tell me just a little bit about yourself so the audience knows what actually drew you to sustainable investing.
When I was at university, I thought the worst thing I would ever do and could ever do was to go and work in finance. I thought it was the worst thing ever, and I didn't want to end up like my friends. So I decided to, after a year of studying abroad, I thought I would go and study environmental technology at Imperial College. And actually, the first job offer I had out of it was going to work in an ethical investment. And it just seemed really interesting and so much more rewarding than all the other jobs that were out there at the time. And then I actually came to realize that finance can be influential in the way that money's run, the way that the world is run, the way that companies run themselves, that actually it can have a lot of influence. So obviously my mind has changed because I've been here ever since, and that was about 16 years ago. So they're quite an okay bunch, actually, these finance people.
And to that influence point, I do want to chat more with you about that later, how money's run in particular. Before we do that, Habiba, over 3 decades ago, you founded Emirates Environmental Group, and I'm keen to understand from your observations over that time, how have attitudes towards sustainability as part of business evolved, particularly in your region?
So, Naomi, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to be in this podcast. So, when I started, co-founded Emirates Environmental Group almost 34 years ago, sustainability was hardly anywhere to be seen or to be discussed, particularly amongst the business world in our region. And I doubt in many parts of the world as well. So the idea of embedding sustainability into the strategy of the organization, into their KPIs, into their financial strategy was not there. So when we started, our focus was how do we raise awareness about sustainability issues? How do we get the private sector into the fold? How do we make them understand that environmental conservation and protection is not just a mere regulatory requirement, but it is really a very good long-term strategy for the longevity of the organization. We saw in the beginning many organizations were not taking it seriously, apart from those multinational organization or large organization who had international markets, and this was a regulatory requirement for them at that time. So they did what was required to be done, but there was nothing above and beyond the compliance requirements. So the gap was huge, and it needed to be closed, and we needed to work with all stakeholders, and that is how we saw our role. And every step that I took, I found that there was a lot more that needed to be done, but there was a good reception as well, and there was a good understanding from all sectors of the society. Slowly but surely, we managed to pull in the academia into the fold. My focus was, how do I build the future generation, build the capacity, mold them, turn them into really environmentalists, and make them part of the solution. But at the same time, while working with academic institutions and with the future generation, you understand that there is a very strong sector of the society that is not involved, and that is the private sector. How do we pull them into the fold, and how do we get them to understand their bigger role in the whole of this equation? And of course, you need the government organizations. So you are working on so many fronts in parallel to ensure that we are all working together. Nobody is left behind. And I think this is where we found our forte, and this is where the private sector understood what we are trying to put on the table, and received it well from us, and put on the table, trusted us to tell us that these are the gaps that we have, and this is where we need to build it. But these are the strengths that we have, that we can add it into your journey to help you strengthen it. And that is how we moved ahead. And Alhamdulillah, today you see that it is not a secondary requirement. It is come into the main streamline of how the organizations are running. And I'm very happy to share with you that when I rolled out the Arabia CSR Awards in 2008 as a recognition platform, as an incentivizing platform, as an inspirational platform, I found that organization, it resonated very well with the private sector players. And every year we increase the categories that we are rolling out to ensure that we have more players coming and joining. Today, the awards enjoys 16 categories, and we have all the big players in the main sectors. You are talking about construction, you are talking about financial, you are talking about healthcare, you are talking about oil and gas, you are talking about energy, a hospitality sector. These are all part of the entities that have understood the importance of this award, and they have taken it, and it has been a continuous learning platform for them to understand what do they need to do in their own organizations, what resources do they require, what strengths do they have to build in their organization to come out of it at the end of the tunnel, understanding and recognizing and labeling themselves as a responsible organization.
And I think there's something interesting there around sharing some of that best practice amongst that group. I imagine that there's a really strong network that has been created. Avery, to that point that Habib has made about resonating with the private sector, a lot of the work that you do is supporting clients on their decarbonisation journey. So I'd really like to get a sense from you in terms of financial institutions, what role they play in this transition, because I think primarily you're focused there. And afterwards, I'd love to get a sense from all of you. Something Habiba said there around there was a regulatory pull at first. And I wonder whether is it okay for it just to be a regulatory pull, or does it need something else? So I'll come to you guys, each of you afterwards, if you'd like to jump in on that. But Avery, to you on that, on the role that financial institutions play.
Well, financial institutions play an absolutely critical role because none of this happens without them. And Naomi, you placed it so well in the sense that the context of raising the climate finance, but also scaling sustainable investment is absolutely critical to the decarbonization journey and our journey to net zero that we're on right now. And so when we think about the private sector and actually how we get that capital moving from one place to another, there's so many, I guess, in my world, challenges that we see, and there's such a variance of maturity that we're seeing various organizations coming to us with. Some want to, to your second question, simply comply with the regulatory environment, and that's what's driving them to kind of seek that consultancy service and to understand, how they fit into that. Others are far more market leading, really wanting to do innovative work. And so it's a challenge to kind of meet them all where they're at when you have that comparative analysis and you can see that wide range of maturity, but also quite a fun problem to solve of why are some of these organizations at this early stage of maturity and how can we help change those hearts and minds to really accelerate finance in the right ways. And so we kind of take them at all these different entry points, really try to understand what those motivators are, and then try to help evolve that in a way that aids the market, in a way that continues that financial flow into both climate finance and sustainable investing, slightly similar but different mechanisms in that way.
Victoria, maybe I could come to you. That piece that Avery just said about simply complying versus capturing the hearts and minds. We've seen a lot of pushback coming, in the last few months, in the last few days, predominantly from the US around ESG investing. I wonder from your perspective whether you think that pushback is justified and whether you think that it's making you think and those that your clients think differently about sustainable investing as a result.
If you sort of look back to 2020, which was like the peak of ESG and sustainability, it was just the hot word. It was a really great time actually for sustainability individuals because finally, after years of working and trying to put the agenda out there and really trying to get buy-in for why this was so critical, and we'd had movement on during the COP negotiations, it finally felt like it was coming to fruition. And I don't particularly want to give a lot of support for the critics and the naysayers that have pushed back on ESG, but there was a lot of hot air, excuse the pun, but there was a lot of stuff that was and greenwash that was out there. I think that there needed to be some rectification in the industry, but I think now what we're now seeing it's an overcorrection, and actually I think it's being really detrimental to some of the really urgent work that's being needed. And so often I hear comments around, oh well, let's talk about batteries, let's say electric car batteries, they're really bad. There's child labor, we should, this is a really bad route to go down. And I think there's a really big misconception that trying to change the way that business is run, the way that the world is run, is going to be a really clean and easy job. So this is where the pushback is incorrect. Changing how we run business and changing how the world operates and how energy operates, if I can just focus on energy for the moment, it's going to be a really dirty job moving from how we currently do it to other forms. Because if we look at batteries, for example, what goes into an electric car battery? We're looking at nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, potentially, graphite. Where do those minerals come from? From developing countries where labour practices are really poor, where children do go out and work in mines because there aren't schools there for them to do. So what are their parents going to get them to do? Because it's a way of life for them. And so I think that it's very easy to throw rocks at sustainability and say, oh, it's all greenwash, or it's, oh, they're not as good as they say that's going to be. But nothing is that simple in life, And the fact is that unfortunately, the pushback is becoming so hard, it's now detrimental to the progress that needs to be made. And we're now seeing that with rollbacks on regulation. We're seeing that in rollbacks on many different initiatives, DE&I. And it's such a shame because we were doing so well. And it's now there is this kind of unfair judgment that sustainability has to be done perfectly and that all the data is perfect and that everything's beautiful and tied up in a bow. That's not how the world works. And so for the critics, I push back to them and say, you did a good piece by making us clean up our act and get rid of greenwash and all the rest of it. But now actually you're undermining the progress that this world desperately needs to make.
Habiba, your region has made incredible progress at great speed in developing alternative energy resources. Do you think, given the rhetoric that Victoria and I have just been discussing, that will slow, or will the pace of change continue?
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. I don't think it will slow. I think it is we have put our foot on the accelerator, and the ambition is running very high. All the members of the society have got the buy-in, and they have got a stake in there, and they are very much on board. We have come up, the president of the UAE, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, has come up with this beautiful concept now for the last 3 years. For the last 2 years, we had the year of sustainability, which really helped so much in getting that message across to every person, even to the guy in the street. Now, this year, we have the year of community. So it has got so many angles of it and so many layers and so many depths. So everybody is keen to see, I want to be part of that. What do I need to do and how can I go about it? And everyone is trying to put the best they have forward to ensure that we do achieve what we set out to achieve. And if you look at the other GCC countries, I think the speed as well is being accelerated. A lot of work is taking place. Sustainability is definitely on the top of the agenda because it is driven by the leadership. Then the government sector is mandated to deliver as well and to come up with the right regulation, to put the right legislations, laws that we need to push this forward. And as was mentioned, I really enjoyed, Victoria, what you said. There is no pushback on our side. Actually, we are pushing what we are all pushing with all our strength to ensure what the strategies and the vision of the leadership does get translated into reality on the ground. And whatever we do at the United Arab Emirates automatically becomes a model that the other countries in the region, nicely see and like and follow up. The collaboration that is taking place between the different government entities across the region is very commendable. The cooperation and expansion that we are seeing amongst the private sector to share best practices is very incredible. The latest technologies that are coming, investors are being attracted to this region, to invest in the clean technology, in clean energy, in innovation. You are seeing scientists, they being attracted to come. If you heard recently, it was announced that we have got a blue visa for anyone who has got expertise in sustainability. As long as they bring, that expertise and they have proof of that, they get a long-term residency in the country with a lot of facilities, a lot of doors opening. All these are attracting the best minds from around the world, from the region, to come back. So we are having this reverse brain coming to our country and our region. And this is helping a lot galvanize it into tangible results and into ensuring that what was announced 2050 to be a carbon neutral country, what will it require? Who will be the main players? What areas we will focus on? These are all issues not just in the pipeline. These are already on the table with a clear strategy in place, with a roadmap, an action plan, and plan in place, and everyone knows what she needs to be doing, whether it's on the individual level or on the institutional level. So there's a lot on a daily basis. There's so much that is going on all fronts. And every event that you will attend, you say, wow, incredible work. You hear something new, you go to another one, you see there's something else that is happening. So there's this positive energy that is evolving, and it is bringing it. And that is what now there is good recognition that sustainability really drives innovation. That sustainability enhances resource efficiency and that it offers tangible financial results, that it was not just in theoretical mode that it was before. No, now they are showing with best practices to support their claim that we are having financial benefit. There's a lot of cost savings in the process, and you are positioning your brand. I know for a fact many companies that started in Dubai, in the 1990s, today they are global players opening operations in 30 countries and they become the best supplier to big players. So you see how the building reputation of the organization has become so important, and ensuring that sustainability is the core of the strategy of that organization. Transparency is very important, and that is an issue that is coming forward, and it is pushed by market demand, it is pushed by regulatory requirements, and it is pushed by the investors who want to see transparency, and that has brought in its wake the importance of non-financial reports. And this is not something that was there, 20 years ago. The first financial report that was issued in this region is 2011. And today, look at the number of sustainability reports that are coming out. And year after year, we are seeing better reports. We are seeing more credible reports, more balanced reports that entities are bold enough to share, to say, this is what we have done, this is what not we have not done yet. this is where our intention is. These are the challenges that we are facing, but this is the actions and the processes that we are putting in place to ensure that we overcome these kind of challenges. So learning from what is happening around the world, bringing the best, avoiding the challenges that the other regions have faced has helped us a lot.
It's incredibly heartening to hear that because at the moment, when everything feels quite negative, quite febrile in geopolitics, to hear about that progress is fantastic. Not least because the voluntary reporting, shifting away from the kind of the regulatory, the mandatory reporting is so crucial. Avery, from your perspective, you've done a lot of traveling. We've seen each other at various COPs. I know you attend the UN General Assembly. I'm keen to understand in terms of the kind of regulation piece and the global policy. Are you hopeful in terms of the policy shifts that are out there that could potentially accelerate more sustainable investment flows, like the ones that Habiba is talking about?
Well, I think, Naomi, if I may, I almost want to first politely disagree with Victoria on the greenwashing front, because I think that there's, the greenwashing is a huge problem, and I don't think anyone's denying that. But I also think that organizations, yes, are going to be rolling back on what they're necessarily saying about climate change sustainability, but not necessarily rolling back on what they're doing. And I think that's where the greenwashing piece becomes particularly interesting or volatile.
So there's a gap between what they're saying and what they're doing. So they're not necessarily publicizing the fact that they're doing.
Well, on both sides of that, like I think a lot of organizations, and the reason greenwashing is such a big challenge is because organizations are saying they're doing things sustainably and not. And I think now hopefully we'll see a bit of a change of that of, organizations are fearful of greenwashing risk, so they won't necessarily be publicizing all the positive things that they are doing. But I also think greenwashing is a risk if you're cutting corners. Greenwashing is not necessarily a risk if you're actually taking fundamental steps to decarbonize your business. As we said, it's going to be messy, but I don't think maybe this is a personal opinion, it can't be messy at the risk of human rights. And it can't be messy at the risk of the global south. And that's where we see climate finance and the negotiations, to your question, Naomi, being so critical, and the voice that we give, low and middle income countries and developing countries, and also the negotiating blocks that we see at the UN. And so I think it's sometimes a challenge to have conversations that are so global north focused and so focused on the kind of mainstream investment when we're not necessarily talking about the financial flows that are going into supporting the DRC, supporting countries that are very mineral rich, but perhaps infrastructure poor, supporting, building those schools and that infrastructure to be able to get children out of those mines. There are more people living in modern slavery right now than there ever have been. And in 2024, solar cracked the top 5 of most at-risk products of modern slavery because of the scale that we're advancing renewable energy. Does that mean we shouldn't do renewable energy? Of course not, but it means that we need to do it in a much more strategic way. And so I think there's a real challenge here when we talk about the regulatory environment. We've just seen the EU omnibus roll back, much of the value chain transparency that was going to be in scope for CSDDD and CSRD, and that includes renewable supply chains. And so without that transparency that we've all been mentioning here, we have the option of not caring, or having the option of thinking that happens in another country, that's not in my value chain, doesn't hit my balance sheet, doesn't hit my regulatory environment in, Victoria, to your point, in the jurisdictions where modern slavery is legislated. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about where our products and our minerals come from, and it doesn't mean that we should be doing this at scale without the risk of, without considering all of the people in the value chain that it impacts. So to go more broad to your question, Naomi, there is a huge role that multilaterals play, obviously, in setting the tone and setting the pace for decarbonization and our pursuit of net zero. Specifically on the just transition side, which is what I focus on, the multilateral space and multilateral development banks in particular play a huge role in first taking on a lot of the risk, in investing in being able to actually get the finance into the global south, and multilateral development bank reform is a probably whole other discussion that we could be having. But I don't think it's the be all and the end all. And I think one of my favorite, and I'm slightly a visual thinker, so not helpful for a podcast medium, but one of my favorite sustainability memes is that Spider-Man, one of them all pointing at each other, that they all look the same. So it's policy pointing at, consumers and voters, and also pointing at businesses saying you should act. It's people saying, well, I don't have the products up, the products aren't affordable, and also government's not doing anything, and business saying the same thing, no one's buying my stuff and no one's investing in it, and there's no policy to make me do it. And so if we all, and I think that's what multilateralism almost perpetuates in a lot of ways. We have everyone pointing at each other saying, well, you start, and no one really working together.
Yeah.
And then to your point earlier, Naomi, it also is very volatile to the geopolitical context that we find ourselves in. This is not a great time for sustainability. And that's been the cover of every single newspaper over the last, 4 weeks in particular. So how do we overcome that where we're not subject to just listening to certain jurisdictions dictate the trends globally? I think business plays and can play a much more significant role in actually being bold in its leadership, and not just looking at sustainability as exclusively environmental, but looking at a holistic approach. ESG means more than just climate, it means more than just social, and it means more than just governance. How we do those things all together and how we facilitate a just transition and how we finance a just transition to renewables and to a net zero and low carbon economy is critical. And so I think there's, I guess, maybe my call to action, which isn't entirely answering your question, but is actually to look at this in a much more holistic way. Can we look to regulation? Well, business doesn't want to. We've seen the rollback of all of that in the omnibus over the last week. Can we look to people? Can we look to policy? I think there's a much bigger role that we all need to be doing together, and a much bolder role that business can play in doing the right thing. The data will tell us that climate risk is an issue for business. It tells us that stranded assets are there. It tells us we can predict all of that. And for some reason, we're still not acting fast enough.
Victoria, with a sort of business hat on, how do we overcome that? I mean, you are more aware than anyone of the blockers to getting more money into the transition, both in the developing and developed countries. What are you thinking about at GIB Asset Management at the moment in terms of how you make this happen?
So I think at the beginning you asked the question, what role is regulation really here playing? And I think in an ideal
Well, I
world,
forgot to come back on that, so
That's
thank you. Yeah.
in an ideal world, everyone would play a part. Okay. That would be wonderful. And maybe I'm just really jaded because I've been working in finance for too long. But having spent my entire career working with companies and knowing what it is that is first going to make them move, it is regulation. That is going to be the first mover because civil society obviously do their part. And when I say civil society, I mean, the person on the street. I'm not talking about NGOs who do amazing work. I'm talking about kind of the average person who doesn't really know much. They'll do their bit of recycling. They'll do their little bit of charity work, but kind of over and above that, there's generally people a little bit too busy to kind of really make the massive strides that regulation really can. And so I think from my perspective as an investor, the current blockers are certainly, as and Avery was just saying, are just really political. But then it's also financial. So if we're looking about companies investing in certain countries that need that investment, let's talk about, I don't know, developing nations, the companies are not going to make those investments if the regulation isn't there to support them. That is too much of a risk for them. They're not going to go there. So what we need is regulation that makes countries investable from that perspective. So we need what I like to call investable nationally determined contributions. Those NDCs, that the climate commitments that countries are making, they need to be investable. And you can bang a company over the head as much as you like at an AGM or, wherever they're listed, but they will not make the move if it doesn't make sense for them financially. And they need to have those subsidies, they need to have that support, and they need those mechanisms in place to kind of move it. Then investors, and I think it was mentioned, Habiba, you mentioned before, have a huge, huge role to play in all of this. And now working very much in the Gulf, the companies, when they talk to me, and also having worked with many other companies from around the world, the investors have asked us for this. What do we do about this? The investors have pushed us to do that. How do we do that? So finance then has a role in unblocking the flows. So I would probably say that it is the politics and the financials that kind of really do get things moving. And that's how I'm really hoping things will progress forwards. And if I could just sort of make a comment, we don't know what's going to happen in the States with the Inflation Reduction Act. But that was a piece of legislation that was brilliant, that was doing multiple things, helping a country, but also putting in tax benefits and subsidy support for all different states to actually help move the dial on technology, on energy, etc. And it is still benefiting many different states. So we don't know what's going to happen with that piece of regulation, but it is benefiting several states that potentially might not be so supportive of sustainability movements today. And I'm really hoping that that is kind of like, a good piece of modern legislation that goes, this actually is beneficial. Sustainability is beneficial. It don't, stop thinking about it as hugging trees. It's actually about making sustainable businesses that benefit everybody.
Habiba, that talks very much, I think, to what you were saying before. And I'm keen to understand in the region, in terms of the regulatory landscape, do you think that more action is needed at the federal level rather than within individual emirates?
Sometimes you find that entities will tell you we get confused from the different sets of regulations that we have to deal with. And that becomes a burden for the private sector to be able to run their businesses efficiently. So, having more standardized, unified set of good laws that has got all the stakeholders involved in it while making it, while bringing it out, and this is not something that you see mainly happening in this region. You'll find a law coming out and then you say, oh, this is not practical, it's not implementable, because not all the stakeholders were involved when that law was being developed. So these are some of the challenges that we need to overcome. We need to work on them very closely. This has always been one of my messages to the private sector, particularly the multinationals that are coming, those who have been in the business for 100 years. They have a lot of global expertise. They have a lot of knowledge. So when they come to work in new markets like our markets, they have an extra responsibility. They can't just depend on complying with the relevant laws that are, the current laws that are out there and say, okay, I was doing this in another part, but I will not do it here because there's no law that requires me to do it. Actually, the responsibility of that entity is to go and share with that government institution. You can do this in a better way if you put this ABC in place. And they should offer that wholeheartedly because that will help them add value to them as well as a business to grow and expand. And once you have this kind of set of rules, laws, and everything that are functioning well, and you are seeing tangible results, this is where you have a best practice that you can share it with the other countries in the region. So having these multiple levels of different types of regulation can be confusing sometimes and can disrupt and become a burden to the growth and the speed that we want to see. So I would love to see a unified set of taking into consideration the latest that is out there, learning from the different regions, and making something adapted to what we require. And so that, the private sector and the different players can adopt it nicely and deliver on it. And it will ensure a smooth sail for everyone involved.
Expecting better of organizations when they land in a new environment. Victoria, final question for you. I'm keen to understand a little bit more because I know that with GIB Asset Management's portfolio, social and gender related factors are baked into the portfolios. How much do you see in the future, given what we are seeing now, social and gender related factors alongside those traditional environmental metrics being baked into investment decisions?
It's a really good question, Naomi. Do you know
But
what?
a tricky one right now.
It's a very tricky one. So thank you for asking me that. Let me see if I can walk this well. It's going to become, if anything, even more important, right? Because if you don't have that backbone of initiative, and I keep on talking about regulation, but regulatory support in a country for this topic, the risks increase multiple times. And so, as an investor, so the way that we do our analysis is we rely a lot on external data, publicly reported data. We integrate that, we chop it up, we do what we want with it, and then we integrate it into the way that we think about a business and analysis. We're really lucky in that a lot of that information has been publicly available, particularly in developed markets. Now, if that falls away, or if we're not seeing how these topics are being addressed or these issues are being addressed, we need to find out even more information. So we're going to have to see investors really innovating on how to get that information, how to get better understanding, and actually what we can be expecting of companies. And Avery made a really good point earlier. Some companies are not sort of speaking very loudly about what they're doing anymore, but they're still doing work in the background. And that's where, as an investor, you play a role and you have that quiet, considered conversation with them, ignoring the noise, because there's a lot of noise at the moment, and we've been having a lot of those conversations with those businesses for sure. But you've got to make sure that it's not excessive green hushing or social hushing, or that actually it actually now just is a lot of PR and nothing's being done, and actually it's all really being repealed. So I've answered your question in a really long way. I think it's going to become even more important, but actually for investors potentially in certain countries, even harder to get that information. And I'm just really hoping that what is happening in certain places isn't then, probably to Habiba's point, oh, well, they're not doing it, therefore we won't have to do it here. Right. So this country isn't doing it, therefore we don't need to do it elsewhere. No, for investors, and I know that those in our field would agree, but I really hope that people now won't go, oh, well, let's just roll back everything globally. No. We've gotten to a point we have to keep on pushing, and we have to keep on pushing that in every country around the world, not just because one place is saying this isn't important anymore.
Avery, final question to you, if I may. I know you lead KPMG's Leaders 2050 program, which is a network for young professionals in the climate and energy space. How optimistic is that group at the moment? And I'd also like to get from you any advice for young professionals who have been interested in this space and who may still be interested but don't really know how to get into it.
I would say that group is cautiously optimistic. And I think it becomes a challenge when you know, are in the private sector, when you've been conditioned by the environment that you've been in, and when you start to understand the boundaries and the barriers and the challenges. I think what I admire most about activists in so many ways, and especially my peers who are activists, is they don't grasp those boundaries. And so the question always becomes, why not? And why can't we do things the way that we should? And so when you chat to folks in the private sector and young people in the private sector, there's this kind of rational thinking of, well, I understand why we can't do it, but how do we start to innovate, and how do we start to actually change that for the better? So I'd say there's a cautious optimism and a deep sense of passion. The folks that I work with in Leaders 2050, and to give context, I guess, to the folks who are listening, this is a network of over 10,000 young people across over 40 countries, all of whom who are working in the private sector or working as young professionals and don't necessarily focus in their day-to-day jobs on sustainability, ESG, and energy transition. They sit in a wide variety of sectors across a wide variety of disciplines, but they're interested in climate, energy transition, and ESG. And I think even that number and that demonstration of people getting involved because they want to learn more about it, they want to understand how their role in HR, in finance, in investment teams, how it can have impact, I think is probably the question we get asked the most often is, what can I do within my role? So I think starting to mainstream sustainability is what we'll see from this next generation. I did a career talk at UCL a couple of weeks ago, and so many young people said to me, oh, I want to be a sustainability consultant. And I said, that's so interesting. Why don't you want to be a procurement manager? Why don't you want to be, work on an investment team? Why don't you want to work? And I think the more that we are able to shape and mainstream that sustainability should be part of all of our jobs, and we should all be contributing to this, I think that's what we'll start to see young people having, quite a lot of impact in their own organizations and quite a lot of impact globally, is actually saying every job is really a sustainability job if you really want it to be. So cautiously optimistic and motivated for sure. We did a piece of research earlier this year where 66% of young people that we surveyed felt responsible for driving climate sustainability and ESG in their own organization. And again, wide variety of disciplines. They don't all work in ESG or sustainability, but only 9% of them feel they have the autonomy to do so. So as the current generation of senior leaders and senior business leaders start to retire, I think we'll start to see that autonomy and that change happen really quickly.
With that demographic shift, cautiously optimistic. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in to Women in Climate. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. As we've heard, the role of finance in driving the global transition to a net zero economy is more critical than ever. And it's women like Victoria Barron, Habiba Al-Marashi, and Avery Johnston who are leading the way in shaping a more sustainable future. As Avery said, when you ask yourself, what can I do in my role? What can I do now? Well, if you enjoyed today's episode, you can do something. You can subscribe, you can rate and review it, and you can share this podcast with others who are passionate about climate action and those who are not, who are just interested in this space, because as we were saying there, we all have a role to play, not just those working in sustainability. You can follow us on social media for the latest updates and more stories from women at the forefront of climate change. We'll be back next time with more conversations that inspire change. And until then, keep pushing for progress and let's continue to work together for a more sustainable, equitable world. Thank you. GIB Asset Management is a boutique asset management firm that provides a diverse investment offering across the risk-return spectrum, in equities and fixed income, alongside their treasury business, which aims to provide effective and bespoke solutions. GIB Asset Management is based in London with an AUM of $6 billion as of December 2024.